So first of all, I welcome all the participants to the EGROW webinar series, which we have been doing for nearly a year now. And in this EGROW webinar series, we have been inviting friends from across the world. We have had a few Nobel laureates. We have had very large number of prominent economists from Harvard, Stanford. We have had lots of people from India speak to us on policy-oriented issues. So the webinar series is basically a discussion on the contemporary issues, and that gels with the policy of the EGROW Foundation, which is a research-based policy think tank. And over this last 1 year, because of COVID, we have taken this advantage of bringing the best minds across the world, both domestic and international, to come and speak to us. It is in this very context that we requested Professor Lekha Chakraborty to speak to us on the macroeconomic issues. And you, as you are aware, a couple of speakers have done this discussion with us during this year. After every wave, we have been discussing this at length. Omicron is behind us, but then now the fear is that we may get stuck in the fourth wave. But much before the fear of the fourth wave, we had requested Professor Lekha to, if he can, come and speak to us on these macro issues. Professor Lekha Chakraborty is a full professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She is an elected member of the Governing Board of Management, International Institute of Public Finance, Munich, the World Association of Public Finance Economists. She is a pioneer economist in institutionalizing gender budgeting in India. She is also research affiliate at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College, New York. Her areas of interest are macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing human development, and gender budgeting. Basically, a fine fiscal expert. She is the recipient of the Infosys Best PhD Thesis Award from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. She is the author of Fiscal Consolidation, Budget Deficits, and Macroeconomy, Sage Publications. This book has received endorsement reviews from Dr. Y.V. Reddy, former Governor RBI, and also from Vito Tanzi, former IMF Executive Director, Fiscal Affairs. She is co-author of the book Social Sector in Decentralized Economy, India in the Era of Globalization, published by Cambridge University Press. She has worked for the IMF, World Bank, the UNSCAP, UNDP, UN Women, and the Commonwealth Secretariat on short stints. So with this wide experience and lots of research on fiscal, we now invite Professor Lekha to come and speak to us for about 40 minutes on macroeconomic policy responses to COVID-19 pandemic. And that will be followed with 15 to 20 minutes of question answer session. Professor Lekha, the floor is yours.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my privilege and it's my honor to speak to you at eGrowth Foundation on the macroeconomic policy responses to pandemic. And I'm very happy when I heard that the session will be chaired by Professor Ashima Goyal. And I don't have PPT. I have a written speech. Given the time management, I will be speaking to you around 20-25 minutes, and then we will open the floor. Okay. The global macroeconomic uncertainties the global macroeconomic uncertainties, the way it impact on the fiscal and monetary policy of India, that to me, it depends broadly on the policy coordination, about the policy certainty. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, this recent Omicron wave, that is, of course, a reminder that, this ever mutating coronavirus will continue as a determinant of the macroeconomic uncertainties. And unlike India, globally, several central banks have begun monetary policy normalization, and that is through reducing their balance sheets by ending the asset purchases, and also through an earlier than expected hikes in policy rates. And as Rubini recently pointed out, this financial markets in the emerging economies, they have turned volatile, indicating strong capital flight with mounting uncertainty on the potential rate hikes by US Federal Reserve. So we have seen in their FOMC meetings and earlier in the Jackson Hole meetings that there could be a plausible series of hikes in the rates by US Fed Reserve. So given this context, RBI in the Monetary Policy Committee deliberations during 8 to 10 February last month, they have of course delayed the normalization procedure by maintaining the status quo policy rate at 4%, because they want to focus on the growth recovery first. And Professor Ashima Goyal is, of course, around, and we can, get her view about what could be the plausible timing in which there could be a hike in the interest rate. But right now, I think the mood of RBI is a growth recovery first, and that's why they have gone for a status quo policy rate. And in addition to this, inflation is rising, and of course, this slow policy tightening by the central bank, that can accelerate, a kind of de-anchoring of inflationary expectations, and that can, of course, aggravate, the growth recovery process. But given the mounting pressures of inflation, as Rubini pointed out recently, if the central banks bite the bullet and become hawkish by hiking the rates, then of course, it affects the credit and the growth recovery process. And given these uncertainties, or given these constraints by the monetary policy stance, now we have to rely on fiscal dominance to counter these adverse impacts of the growth recovery process, of especially these exogenous supply shocks. So given that globally, the fiscal authorities have increasingly been accommodative, they have accommodated very high fiscal deficits and high fiscal debt to support the growth recovery. But the servicing of these debts will become very expensive if there is hike in interest rates. So the public debt management on one side and economic recovery on other side, and the dilemma of the RBI, and that is quite real. And also, there is an increasing recognition for the accommodative fiscal space in the time of pandemic from the point of view of efficacy of the fiscal rules. Should we, strictly bind to the numerical threshold ratios of the fiscal deficit? Can that fiscal deficit be growth enhancing? Or we need to recalibrate the fiscal rules in the times of pandemic? So these are the questions, we need to address. Otherwise, if the path to fiscal consolidation is through expenditure compression than increased tax buoyancy, then the quality of fiscal consolidation gets affected. And of course, Oliver Blanchard and many economists pointed out that high fiscal deficit has no fiscal cost if we can substantiate that by increasing public investment or reducing the output gap. And of course, this is the narrative of the Union Budget 2022, that we have high fiscal deficit, but we substantiate that by focusing on enhancing the public infrastructure investment, especially the capital infrastructure investment. And but when you look at the global uncertainties, the International Monetary Fund, they revised the global output and the trade growth projections for 2022 downward to a 4.4, and 6% from the earlier forecast of 4.9% and 6.7%. And this is as per the updates of January 2022 in the World Economic Outlook. And these revisions in the global growth is due to the hardening of commodity prices, of course, the volatility in the energy prices, and mounting inflationary pressures. And the war in Ukraine will aggravate these global stagflationary recession because the inflationary expectations are being unanchored, and there will be a huge, massive negative supply shock will be there on the global economy, and that could reduce the growth further. And as I mentioned, this volatility in energy prices and that spike in the oil prices to well above $100 per barrel, along with the other hardening of other commodity prices that can add to these global uncertainties. And against the backdrop of these uncertainties, the center banks, whether they hike or not hike the interest rates, I think there will be repercussions. That's exactly the policy dilemma when we think about the monetary policy stance. And that's why we need to focus on fiscal dominance, when there is huge uncertainties from the monetary policy front. And if you look at the MPC decisions meticulously, of course, their growth projection is around 7.8, and the status quo repo rate at 4%. And repo rate, the reverse repo rate, the way they manage the monetary corridor, still in the accommodative phase. We have not gone into the neutral phase. And through that, the status quo rate of reverse repo rate at 3.35%. And there is no normalization process yet regarding the reverse repo rate as well. Because if you look at the cutoff yield rate of the variable repo rate, you can see that it's risen up to 3.99%. Otherwise, there is no formal announcement on the marginalization procedure from the RBI front. And that normalization procedure is crucial from the perspective of the term structure of interest rate. But we need to delay the normalization procedure for the growth recovery process. And that exactly is a dilemma. And the term structure of interest rates, if you look into the link between the short-term and the long-term rates of interest, and we know that the call money market rates are below repo rate. And of course, on the long term, the security rates, the GSEC rates for the above 10 years and 15 years, that's also going haywire. So term structure of interest rate is a matter of concern. And of course, we have impending taper tantrums and the plausible rise of policy rates by the US Fed Reserve. And that could trigger a capital flight if we don't go for a corresponding rise in the interest rates. So these are the dilemmas. So in 2013, we responded to the taper tantrum to capital controls, not to interest rate defense in the beginning. And we also tried to intervene in the foreign exchange markets. But we understood that these are partial interventions. And ultimately, we have to make our macroeconomic fundamentals strong to respond to these crises. And when we talk about macroeconomic fundamentals, the levels of fiscal deficit to GDP, that's one of the crucial parameter. And right now, if you go for, making it all right by keeping it 3% of GDP, then that fiscal discipline can be, little bit, adverse. It has got its own adverse impacts on growth. It cannot be growth stimulating. That's a point I want to highlight over here. And exactly from that perspective, finance minister has owned that narrative, the taxonomy of crowding in, not crowding out. When we look into the crowding out, from the neoclassical perspective, a rise in the public investment that leads to a displacement or crowding out of private corporate investment. But finance minister from the position of strength refuted these arguments that in the context of an emerging country like India, exactly, the rise in the interest rate, the rise in the, one moment. So it's not exactly the crowding out, what she has clearly communicated to gain the investors' confidence is that in the context of emerging countries like India, it's going to crowd in rather than crowding out. And there is a taxonomy of crowding out, as I mentioned, and there could be real crowding out or there could be financial crowding out. So we need to empirically look into the question whether high public investment crowd out financially or in terms of the real crowding out. And real crowding out is when the public investment displaces private corporate investment broadly, as I mentioned, on a dollar for dollar basis, irrespective of the mode of financing of deficit. But financial crowding out, that's a phenomenon of partial loss of, the capital formation in the private sector due to rise in interest rates emanating from preempting of the loanable funds to finance the deficits. So that's a concern. And empirical evidence, including I have a paper on, what encourages private investment in India. And this paper we have written together with Professor Rishikesh Vinod of Fordham University and my colleague in IMS, Dr. Karan. And we have identified that the significant determinant of private corporate investment is public investment, and using the MEBOT analysis. MEBOT in the sense we use the maximum entropy ensembles methodology because the time series was limited, and also we had the problem, econometric problem of mixing I0 and I1 variables. The variables were integrated of different order. So we use the maximum entropy ensembles to tackle these issues. And we identified that it's not interest rates. Interest rates, of course, matters for these, private corporate investment, but more than that, public investment, public capital, infrastructure investment is crucial for crowding in of private corporate investment. And we have to wait and see whether that cycle is going to get triggered in the context of India. And here, the mechanism in which the public investment crowds in private investment will be, of course, through the multipliers related to the capital infrastructure. And Union Budget 2022-23 has given emphasis to this narrative, but we have to wait and see. So here, one point I would like to highlight is it's not really the levels of deficit that matters, the mode of financing the deficit that is also equally a matter of concern, because excessive deficit, mode of deficit, any mode, whether it is seigniorage or whether it is bond financing or external financing, that has got its own macroeconomic repercussions. And over the years, we have moved away from the seigniorage or the print money and finance the deficit through ad hoc treasury bills. And right now, our predominant source of financing deficit is bond financing of deficit. But quite contrary to the textbook macroeconomics that the bond financing of deficit is going to crowd out private investment, Finance Minister, from a point of strength, she articulated that it's going to crowd in if you're using the use of the debt or the use of the fiscal deficit is to enhance the private public capital infrastructure or to reduce the output gaps. But here, output gap is also another controversial variable in the macroeconomics. And, the way we compute the output gap using the econometric filters, and that's a matter of concern because, we call that we take out the cyclicality of the series and call the trend as our potential. So the way we arrive at the potential output methodologically, these are matters of concern. And of course, the macroeconomic framework of pandemic economics, if it is based on the business cycles, and if we think that these are not the cyclical elements, if these are really permanent scars on the economy, then using the business cycles as the analytical framework for fiscal and monetary policy to act as counter-cyclical policy tools will also be questioned, because the moment we correct the cyclicality, then the growth will go back to the prior pandemic or prior crisis position, if that we cannot make that strong assumption if that business cycle that doesn't operate in the context of an emerging country like India. And especially in the time of pandemic, the drop in the GDP could be even the permanent scars in several sectors, and not at the aggregate level, but we have to look into the sector levels, because we have seen that the recovery is uneven. And uneven recovery, when it is a matter of concern, we need to look into the counter-cyclical fiscal policy or counter-cyclical monetary policy, from a point of, caution. That's what I want to highlight over here. Now, it is not only economic growth that matters. We need to take the paradigm ahead to growth plus, to the financing human development, and also incorporating the climate change and the climate risk and uncertainties, to have a complete macroeconomic policy to respond to the pandemic and to this crisis. And here, that is again a matter of debate, that climate change, whether that's a cup of tea of monetary policy stance. Why, many economists, including Rekram Rajan, pointed out that, the toolkits available with the monetary policy stance, that is limited when we talk about, the, what do you call, the RBI or the central bank's perspective. But against the backdrop of Glasgow deliberations and all, the fiscal policy for the first time ever focused on the climate risk and uncertainties, and we have announced green bonds. And this green bonds, that's a thematic bonds within the gross market borrowing that's going to happen in the context of India. And this green bond is exactly an onshore rupee denominated sovereign bond. It's a debt instrument to strengthen the green infrastructure projects. So integrating climate change criterion on the fiscal policy, that's quite comfortable. And we have not begun this in integrating climate change in the fiscal policy from this union budget 2022 to 23 onwards. We have done that. Prior to that, in 2014, the first country ever in the world was India to integrate climate change criterion in the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And this green bond, that's of course a policy strategy to finance the just transition towards sustainable climate resilient economy, but that's not the first ever initiative. Prior to that, the 14th Finance Commission onwards, we have thought about it, and we integrated the climate change criterion into the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And of course, 15th Finance Commission retained the criteria. So it is quite comfortable on the fiscal policy front. But on the monetary policy front, Hansen, in his work, in the Journal of Monetary Economics in 2021, in that article, he mentioned that, quickly devised policy tools unsupported by empirically grounded quantitative modeling could backfire if or when climate policy targets are missed, and that can harm the reputations of central banks and weakening their ability to act in future, and could compromise central bank independence. So that's a caution he made. And he basically, what his argument was, the primary responsibility of monetary policy stance is price stability and financial stability, but getting into the climate change commitments and distinguish between the brown bond and the green bond, that kind of things can, trigger political economy narratives, and it can risk the reputation of central banks. But at the same time, you can counter argue the financial stability in turn depends on the climate change risk and uncertainties. So if you don't go for green stress test of the top banks and investment, that could actually be a partial response. That can be a counter argument. And Bank of England, for the first time ever, integrated the green stress test into the monetary policy stance. But European Central Bank is also, Christine Lagarde is very vocal about it. And greening of monetary policy is a chapter in RBI recent documents. But we have to wait and see how the RBI is going to, take it ahead, how they are going to do the greening of monetary policies. And of course, when the predominant narrative of the macroeconomic policy response to the pandemic is through the credit infusion, we also need to look into whether this credit deployment is uneven or not. And the recent credit deployment statistics, showed that there is an uneven access to the credit, and there is also, mounting pressures. When we look into the recent financial stability report of RBI, they have done certain scenarios, and the stress scenario, there will be, cases of mounting NPA. So the financial stability, when no corresponding increase in the credit growth, and when there is credit deployment, that's a crucial way in which we responded to the crisis that can lead to mounting NPS. And in the works of Stiglitz and Rashid also, which economic stimulus package works, in that work, they also highlighted that credit related macroeconomic stimulus packages have limited multiplier effects. So given this, we need to take it ahead from the credit deployment, and monetary policy has of course limitations in triggering the economic growth process. Fiscal dominance is quite relevant, and there, the efficacy of fiscal rules needs a relook, whether we get into a bad equilibrium, we if we don't keep this fiscal rules. That is a question every time we are asked, that what's the relevance of the fiscal rules in the time of pandemic. But as Oliver Blanchard rightly pointed out, you keep a contingency fiscal rule, but don't use it in the time of pandemic because it can adversely affect the growth recovery process. So these are the quick points I thought that I will highlight. And over to you, Professor Charan Singh, and I can take the questions. We can open the floor. Thank you so much.
Professor Ashima has joined us, so I'm going to hand over the chairs of the session. Professor Ashima, please.
Thank you, Charan. Sorry, Lekha, I thought you were starting at 4:30. You seem to have finished speaking very fast. So I missed much of what you said. But just to take up on what I heard you speak about the risks in a credit-fueled stimulus. So just to put the context, in India, we were coming out, we had a kind of credit boom in the 2000s, right? We had that infrastructure push and a huge amount of credit. The public sector banks were sort of pushed into lending, right? And then we went into those NPAs. And so we had an overreaction and extremely tight monetary fiscal conditions all through the 2010s. Yeah. And this was the period of quantitative easing with huge inflows and liquidity from abroad. And despite that, Indian interest rates were very high. And the credit risks were concentrated in a few infrastructure firms. And throughout this period, you had deleveraging of firms, you had public sector banks. So my own view of public sector banks is that they are more sinned against than sinning, though they have plenty of sins also. So, they had been, because they're pushed in social directions. So, and if they have some independence, I find that they are actually more compliant than private, who sort of try to cut corners sometimes. Yeah. So what happened was that throughout the 2010s, credit in India was not taking off at all because there was this overreaction in terms of high real interest rates, everything. If you compare, the BIS numbers show us that compared to emerging markets, Indian private and corporate debt was about half, while public debt is high, it's double. These are, broad what I remember, so not exact, but the directional. So therefore, when we entered this COVID period, it was clear that the government borrowing needed to be restrained. So this cry for a fiscal stimulus, and my other view is that in India, because we have a huge population, 1 billion plus, a very narrow tax base, and we have followed an extensive cross-subsidization. So if you start cross-subsidization, you have huge numbers, so it can be very, very large. And it went through prices, so it created all sorts of distortions in the economy, right? But from the financial sector, and this is another thing you see, even international agencies, World Bank, Moody's, saying that the financial sector surprised on the upside. So there was this whole story being, dimmed about the risks in Indian banks. And this time I had joined the IDBI board because I was studying NPAs and I wanted to find out, on the floor what. And I was surprised. I mean, they were doing a lot of things. So I knew when the FSR of the RBI, for example, predicted that with COVID, the NPAs would rise. I said, no, they will not. And actually they fell. Why? Because they'd already done a lot of provisioning, and with IBC, some money coming back was adding to profits, so on. So the point is that banks were healthy, but they were risk averse. They'd all started doing risk-based lending. No? So, and you were in a situation where you needed to increase household and corporate borrowing, but you needed to restrain public borrowing. Because in emerging markets, you know that the rating agencies and outflows and how risk premiums can rise and raise interest rates throughout, right? So therefore, something like the credit warranty scheme, which encouraged banks to lend, and it was also healthy in the sense of being in the direction of reforms, yeah, because it was the risk was with the government. You know, the government would take it up, not the bank. So it would not create NPAs for banks, right? So, you know, and at the same time, it did not crowd out private sector borrowing today. It need not add to debt tomorrow to the extent that there's a recovery and people are able to repay. And just recently, I was listening to Mr. Kamath. You know, he was saying he was in that restructuring committee and talking to everybody. They decided that the demand for restructuring loans will be something like 100 billion. The actual demand was only 7 billion. And why? Because recovery was also much faster than expected. Yeah. So there must have been something about our monetary fiscal policies, because, you know, initially people said India had such a large growth fall during the lockdown, and that explains the much higher than expected recovery. But, you know, the latest IMF numbers show that for the year as a whole, the growth shortfall was much higher in countries like Italy, Spain, Brazil, a lot of emerging markets also. But India's growth is higher than all of those in 21. You know, so there's something about either the local resilience despite the absence of large government support, or that this credit-based stimulus helped. Yeah. So I'm sorry to be really going into all this without having heard all your talk. But from the little I heard, it seems to me that your view is that monetary stimulus will not work, fiscal stimulus is required, and India has done too little of fiscal stimulus and too much of monetary. So, I mean, I think I've given a somewhat opposite perspective. So please come in with your views on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have two concerns, well taken the points, but I have two concerns. One is the uneven access to the credit, the small firms and all, they have uneven access to the credit. Second, in the fiscal policy front, we have huge problem with the marksmanship, what we predict and what we have this estimates on board. So these are the two immediate concerns that I have. And when we look into the macroeconomic policies from these two perspectives, the focus of the macro stimulus packages on the credit front, whether that is quite partial or not, that's my concern. Because on one side, we can provide the credit, but if we have the fear of getting the economic activity to be revived and how you repay the credit, so these are the concerns of especially the small firms. So who access the credit is a matter of serious concern. And in the credit deployment statistics, it's not the small and the medium term firms that access the credit market. So that uneven access, that's a matter of concern. And second, why I believe that the fiscal policy dominance is crucial, because certain things, like to support, the people, the humanitarian crisis, how we support, maybe fiscal policy has got a major role to play over there. And right now, what has happened, what worried me is that on the fiscal policy front, we focused on the capital infrastructure investment to crowd in the private corporate sector, but at the same time, the revenue spending, that's an area of concern, that several elements of the revenue spending got curtailed, which were directly, financing human development aspects. And and on the other side, monetary policy front, the rate reduction and the economic recovery, that was not happening in a one-to-one way. I know that you have articulation regarding this, and I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, so here I think that we need to look at outcomes finally. As I said, Indian recovery is sort of better than
We probably lost Professor Ashima. I think she must be trying to come back. In the meantime, Professor Lekha, I had another question for you. Listening to you, what was your feeling that while I myself has been advocating that the fiscal rules, especially the Maastricht rules, the 3% and 60% needs to be relaxed during this time. And I am also,
yeah,
yeah,
now you
Professor.
can hear?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was just saying that that the recovery is better than expected, and the recent revisions also support that, and they have better data on the small scale industry and so on. And it's like TN used to say that the poor can't afford to be unemployed. So just as in the West, there was so much support, they were worried about zombies. Here, you had people substituting out wherever they could because they had to do it to survive. And if you talk, I've been going to a lot of SME association, meetings and so on to find out what is happening. Many of them are very, very gung-ho about opportunities, about digitization, access to fintech, opportunities that this period has given them. You substitute towards making masks or whatever, wherever the demand is. So that is one side of it. The second is that our fiscal deficit this time's budget estimates were 42 or 47% interest payments. So now, if that is a danger, no, when you have 1 billion plus population and a very narrow tax base, and then are you going to monetize the deficit? As it is, the deficits rose from about 70% to 90%, which is a steep rise. So can you monetize? And now today we are worried about inflation. And therefore, if interest rates go up, then we know what will happen to this interest burden. So we have very few choices. It would be wonderful if we could provide support to all those who have suffered. But I think the free food, prevented the sort of Great Bengal famine, free vaccination. That was huge support, that met the needs, the special needs of this time. And then the other thing I want to talk about is our experience in the 2010s. When the earlier government did farm loan waivers, the UPA government, and there was a huge amount of spending in agriculture. And then food inflation just shot up. And then you had to have monetary tightening, you had double deficits and what I call the lost growth decade. So when you support consumption, where there are supply constraints as in agriculture at that time, then you can, and you're seeing this in the US also. They had such a huge fiscal stimulus, now they have inflation. In India, we never had a long period of low inflation. So you can easily run into really severe inflation, which will require enormous tightening and an inflation targeting regime, a large rise in interest rates. And for 10 years, we have had an investment slowdown. So what you really need is an expansion in capacity. The other interesting issue is this thing about comparing Indian and US inflation. In the COVID era, the idea that supply bottlenecks are temporary and therefore the US delayed its tightening, its monetary policy, kept saying that inflation is temporary. In India, we've had supply side bottlenecks for a long time. My view is that there are constant cost push, which keeps inflation high in India. But the policies, the fiscal response, even was designed at reducing this cost push, at reducing supply bottlenecks. Like Gati Shakti wants to bring down logistics costs by 3%. So this is something that, so there was a direct action on the longer run supply bottlenecks, while the short term global supply bottlenecks may be temporary, but because of the multiple waves of COVID and now Ukraine, they're multiple and therefore they could be persistent. But the long-term persistent kind of supply side inflation, I think a lot of the government policies are designed to reduce that. And that is exactly what is required. That is the best way to reduce inflation. That is why I say that if the government is acting on the supply side, like we saw in the MPC in November, household inflation expectations were really going up because oil prices had tightened globally, etc., etc., and huge tax increases here in India. Tax was increased when oil prices fell. So then the government cut excise taxes in November. And end November, we saw those household inflation expectations had come down by as much as 150 basis points. So this is direct supply side action that can keep inflation, which can, if as long as this Ukraine oil price hike is temporary, there is room to do that kind of adjustment. And that provides some kind of demand support also, because it will reduce the burden on individual wallets, and it will decrease costs for industry. So, that is one leeway India has to absorb these global shocks. I think the world as a whole has been very unfair to emerging markets, put a lot of the burden of adjustment of every crisis on us. And we have to design our own policies to smooth these shocks. I think a major reason for the slowdown we saw through the 2010s was excess volatility of interest rates because of global shocks, starting with the global financial crisis, not able to smooth, then euro debt crisis, then the taper crisis. So we have to use our monetary fiscal tools in order to, keep real rates near equilibrium. Yeah. And then if R is less than G, because we are in transition, we can have high growth rates. Then that is the way to create jobs in a sustained way without resulting in inflation. The best way of fiscal consolidation, because R less than G brings down debt ratios. Yeah, so we have narrow room and we have to move very carefully in that. We cannot afford to just subsidize billions of people, go to 30% fiscal deficit, and create inflationary pressures, which will then again lead to the problems of the 2010s. And we have to revive the private investment cycle. So public investment does crowd in private investment. But it's very important that that public investment is what I call smart, green, low cost, intelligent, not building huge roads that are, but so houses for the poor, roads in rural areas. One reason for the huge agricultural exports we're seeing is really that logistics has improved a lot in rural areas.
Yes, thank you. But I have only one concern regarding this. As you rightly mentioned, of course, we have this R, it's not greater than G. So that's okay. If the R is greater than G, then we have to eventually think of monetizing the deficit. That's a different question. But right now, we are basing the expenditure decisions and expenditure priorities on the assumption of revenue stability. When revenues are uncertain, we cannot go for a high deficit or a high debt program because, as you rightly mentioned, what will happen if the interest payments to the revenue receipts ratio go up beyond 40%? That concern, I understand. But, from the perspective of intergeneration liquidity, if we are using this high debt and high deficit, even if we are going to monetize finitely, linking it to maybe a public works employer of last resort programs by the government, or linking, I'm not talking about the cash transfers, because cash transfers, we don't have any evidence that the propensity to save or the spend will be greater than propensity to save. So it's not the cash transfers what I'm talking, but how we can increase the fiscal space when the revenues are uncertain, when we cannot go for expenditure compression because it will create a lot of issues regarding the humanitarian crisis or financing human development perspectives. So then, what we tried was only the disinvestment or the privatization, which again is not working the way we aspire it to work. So here the fiscal space is a matter of huge concern. But then, the question, where is the money? It all depends on the revenue stability, that we need to be very cautious for the expenditure decisions and the priorities. Then in that process, are we not looking into the certain questions related to social infrastructure and employment generation? So these were might matter. Of course, here the fiscal space is quite crucial, and monetization of deficit, it's not plausible because We have done that earlier, and it has led to the inflationary pressures, and fiscal profligacy may open. But how we can enhance the fiscal space? But I still believe that, the credit infusion and the credit related, narrative, that has got limited multiplier effects in the context of an emerging country like India. So I have these concerns, and I thought that you can, yeah.
Well, I was just, I think that our experience, that we are, as I said, that our credit ratios are very low. They need to rise for private and for private parties, and decrease with the government. And there are some signs this is happening, and in a healthy way, without creating the NPAs that you're afraid of. Because lending thousands of crores to a kingfisher and lending 10, 20 crores to an FSME. Lot of banks, even Kotak is lending out because under the government, and they're doing it in a careful, risk-based, assessment of the business proposition. Fintechs are basing it on cash flows. Then we have corporate bond markets for the higher rated corporates. We have venture funds. So that diversity makes the financial sector more stable. Yeah, that is one. And the second is that I think this government is seriously trying to restructure expenditure towards infrastructure, to an educational environment. Green, they're doing a lot, but in education and health are also state subjects. So better center-state coordination is essential for that. But that is the motivation of the privatization: restructure public assets towards providing social goods that develop capabilities, give people the ability to participate in growth, and that is much more sustainable than giving loans or suppressing prices, which is what India has done in the past, creating cross subsidies that raise costs and are not sustainable. Charan, I think I've spoken a lot, and I can't see any questions in the chat. Maybe I can't access them. So if there are questions for her from others, if anybody else wants to ask questions, please.
Sure. Dr. Ashok wants to ask, but before that, I also had one thought for seeking the views of Professor Lekha. One of it was, we have handled the three waves, and I would say we have handled it well. We have given exact doses that were wanted in trying to ensure that the economy doesn't sag. And obviously, in bad times, we did not expect the economy to fly, but we are still the fastest growing economy in the world. That shows that we have met the expectations of both the industry and agriculture, of course, was doing well. But we have met the expectations of the industry and the people, so the economy is reasonably well on the track. Now, my worry is, as everybody knows, that the fourth wave seems to be round the corner. Means initially, about a fortnight back, I was wishing it away, but then what happened in China, and then the predictions that are taking place, that by June we would be in the thick of things. If it happens, if it doesn't happen, we are lucky. If it happens, is what are the views of how are we going to handle it, given that we have handled the three waves and we are already on a very thin ice now. We have already exhausted everything that we could have tried or taken care of the demand. Now, what going forward? So, any thoughts on that? And I do not know, Professor Ashima, if you want to collect other questions. There's a question from Dr. Ashok. There's a question from Kanakala Satyanarayana, and then probably Professor Lekha can answer them together.
Yes,
whatever you decide as the chairperson.
Ashok, please go ahead. Your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, chairperson. You made very succinct kind of comment as usual, but I must say you have crossed and reached the bar of your own standards. So I'm delighted to hear you. I was listening very carefully, and Professor Lekha, wonderful exposition. My question is very simple because you have covered everything, but nevertheless, there is one small thing. Now, see, in the current year, the the food production has broken all the previous record of 316 million ton. So I find a sort of paradox, which is also juxtaposed by the Ukraine and Russia kind of thing. On one hand, our production has increased very significantly compared to the all preceding years, and the prices are still rising, and the food prices in particular, because it has the international kind of regions which explain this. But domestically, as you saw, on one hand, COVID has depressed the growth rate in some sense, but at the same time, inflation is very high. So how the poor people, the downtrodden, they reconcile to this situation, and how we go about, because now there is a risk of fourth kind of COVID sort of thing is looming large on this. There are prediction by medical experts that the fourth wave will also come. So these 3-4 factors, how do you see the things will emerge in next 6 to 9 months? What's your take on that?
Okay, let me go ahead.
There was one more question. Can we collect that from somebody?
There's a question from Kanakala. And then
Kanakala, would you ask your
Kanakala,
question?
please. So Kanakala Satyanarayana. And then, of course, Palak Jain has put a question in the chat box. Mr.
Yeah, I
Kanakala?
replied to her.
Oh, you have. Okay. Kanakala?
I think she's not there. So Lekha, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Let me take Professor Charan Singh's question prior to Professor Ashok's question. Regarding how we are going to face the next, of course, it's a health crisis. The next wave, I don't know, Professor Ashima Goyal may have a different opinion, but I think using this crisis as an opportunity to increase the, health expenditure in our country, instead of ad hoc decisions on increasing the expenditure for the vaccination and also for the responsiveness in terms of the infrastructure, can we go for a substantial increase in the public health sector to GDP ratio? Because that is, when we look into the figures of the union government, that is now not even 1% of GDP. Of course, it is a state priority. It's a state subject, but center government, what can we do about, what can the center government do about enhancing the public spending as a percentage of GDP in terms of enhancing the infrastructure in primary, secondary, and tertiary? Of course, last budget is announced, but there's quite a bit of ambiguity that over the next 6 years, how that's going to get rolled out. That what was that announced, but of course, that's a jump from 0.6 to 0.8, but still we are below 1% of GDP. So how we can strengthen the public sector health infrastructure and the health related investment? So that's one thing in which we can be responsive and we can be prepared prior to this pandemic. That preparedness can be done if you focus on the health sector. So investment in health sector prior to that next wave, that's what I'm thinking. But of course, it's not insurance related policies, because even if the government come up with a good lemon policies, insurance policies, the catastrophic nature of the household expenditure, that can go further catastrophic, even when we have a government run insurance package to cover, the health issues. So not in terms of the health insurance, but other components of the health investment and the infrastructure policies and the health policies, what we can do in this coming months. So that's what I'm thinking about the health sector and the preparedness for the pandemic. Otherwise, the health crisis will of course mount into prolonged macroeconomic crisis, because a lockdown strategy that can only buy time to flatten the wave, but it will lead to irreversible economic disruption. So that's my concern. And now coming to the sector, agriculture. The gross capital formation in agriculture, that needs to be given focus, because if the price, intervening in terms of price or supporting farmers through the income transfers. Of course, there is a lot of debate regarding that, whether we intervene in the price markets, the prices. That is a better way than providing income transfers to the farmers. But of course, government has now announced targeted cash transfers for supporting the farmers. So that's absolutely, to me, it's a better way that intervening in terms of income transfers than we intervene into the price mechanism. And of course, the focus on gross capital formation in the agriculture needs to be strengthened. And over to you, Professor Goyal.
Yeah, thank you, Lekha. So yeah, I agree with you absolutely about health expenditure. And I think there's an opportunity in the sense all the sort of clinics that were set up for vaccination, they should set up local kind of expand the they had this idea of, apart from Ayushman and insurance through the big hospital, set up what is it, well-being centers, or the first sort of where people come for initial help and prevention. So I think that to really expand that, it would be a great source of employment as well. So I think that is an opportunity. But again, that requires very good coordination between the first, second, and third cities in the panchayat, which is missing here. So I've been arguing that you need a fiscal interstate council where people can sit together, count things, and make the expenditure much more effective. But this fear of a fourth wave, let us hope it doesn't come. And I think in India, we have the advantage of full vaccination as well as immunity through exposure to that Delta. It gave a lot of immunity, which now we are seeing in South Korea and China, where they did not go through initial waves. Now they are really suffering. They're not able to stop it. It seems that you just have to go through at least, some degree of infections in order to be able to develop some immunity. But I think we've also learned in terms of how to handle it economically with minimal damage. So in that way, we are somewhat prepared. Because the lockdown, of course, that time we had no health infrastructure, so it was very severe, huge economic damage. But the second wave, but the human cost was much higher than the economic, because I think in September we discovered that when you unlock selectively and you leave lockdowns to local decision, but you ensure that interstate communication is affected to the least possible way, then the disruption of supply chains is the least. So we saw the economy recovering in September when, under the sequence of unlocks, interstate movement was protected. So even in the third wave, as long as interstate movement, the supply chain, most of the factories continued, were able to continue. And the economic damage was the least among all the waves. So in that way, we are somewhat prepared. But I think the main problem is people's patience is exhausted. How much can you, this isolation and wearing masks? Like today is Holi. We all are playing downstairs with colors and, no physical distancing. And they were allowed, to impose and maintain that discipline, but there will be no alternative but to reimpose all that social distancing, masking, that we have to continue. Yeah. So I think if there are no more questions, and I
Professor,
think...
Professor, can I just ask one more question? Means both
Please,
of you are here. She's from the National Institute. You are a fiscal expert. What is the take that you would have of pushing the frontier of fiscal expansion tolerance? We have recorded a very high gross fiscal deficit. Would we repeat it? Would we have to go for borrowing program, which is very large? Will the market receive it and will the market accept it? Or are there out of the box measures which we in India could probably experiment? Say, agriculture tax beyond a certain threshold, or we revisit the wealth tax, or we invite the rich now to please cooperate and we impose a richness tax. What do you think would come to the rescue in case we really get into the mess of the fourth wave? Any thoughts on that?
Okay, let me begin with that debt and deficit which you were arguing for. Of course, in the times of pandemic, that excessive deficit procedure part that needs to be medium term, because instantaneously reducing the deficit or debt that can adversely affect the recovery, economic growth recovery. And we have that by 2025-26 we need to take it down to 4.5, but initially it deviated from that 3% of GDP fiscal rule. But maybe that we are incorporating the budget transparency issues as well, the off budget borrowings and all, now getting into the concept of fiscal deficit. We have seen that budget transparency issues getting on board. So if that is the case, instead of constructing a PSBR, the public sector borrowing requirement, a certain component of the off-budget borrowings we are incorporating into fiscal deficit and keeping the fiscal deficit threshold ratio at 4.5 instead of 3%. And that's a medium term. That excessive deficit procedure of the government is welcome. That's important, because right now, if we go for 3%, that can affect the growth recovery process. And now comes the golden rule. So that's a matter of concern, whether we should be following a golden rule, like keeping the revenue deficit zero or phasing out of revenue deficit this moment. So there, we need an articulation that right now, revenue deficit is not bad in the time of pandemic. All what we earn through the revenue receipts should be equal to the revenue receipts, revenue expenditure, and whatever we borrow has to be entirely for the capital spending. That narrative may not work well in the time of pandemic. So that golden rule, we cannot have this moment. And now coming to the tools or the fiscal instruments to enhance the fiscal space. The taxation, a government has not gone into enhancing the fiscal space through the tax instruments, and that's welcome, because that will further affect the disposable income in the hands of people. And that's quite welcome that we have not touched that field. Rather, we were doing it through the debt deficit dynamics. But, elongation of the maturity structure of the public debt, that is another way we can do it, like, Operation Twist by the RBI, like simultaneously buying and selling of bonds, like selling long-term and selling short-term and buying long-term. So that kind of strategies for the debt market as well, to get that refinancing risk postponed through the elongation of the maturity structure. That could be one way in which we can play. But taxation, I'm not convinced whether right now we will be able to do that, especially when it will affect the disposable income in the hands of people. But all what we tried right now is we have done the 30% tax for the crypto, for that speculative assets. And there also, Professor Goyal may be able to tell us better whether using the tax policies, are we curbing the speculation in the market so that its impact on the financial stability will not be adversely affected. So are we doing that narrative, or using the taxation, are we making the crypto assets little legitimate or venerable? But tax officials have increasingly pointed out that taxing an asset, it doesn't make it legitimate. So we don't know what exactly was the narrative when government announced only the increase in the taxation, that 30% taxation only for that speculative asset. I leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of restructuring going on in the fiscal space, which will increase space. So this idea of the rich contributing, maybe voluntary contribution, the very rich, because we know that certain, people have, this is a feature of the modern economy, those in networked industries tend to, and you have examples of extreme philanthropy. So I think leaving it as a decision and kind of moral, that is one way. But also the government just selling Air India, so much burden on the taxpayer is gone. LIC IPO, then monetization of assets, which increases efficiency as well as perhaps, and these things take a very long time in the public sector because there's so many processes and so many different ministries to coordinate, but it seems to be going now. So I think And then we are seeing that GST, as it's maturing, the revenue elasticity is increasing. I think that demonetization did increase the number of taxpayers, the tax returns filed, the information on taxpayers. So direct tax is also, you're seeing more elasticity. But the corporate tax, because they want to use that to increase investment. So it's for a limited period that the concession has been given. And in this period, you want the investment to be forthcoming, so you can't raise that. But it's true, the leakages should be plugged, such as rich agriculturalists. So increasing the tax base and reducing loopholes through which people escape taxation, so that everybody is paying a certain amount and we move to becoming a tax compliant society, I think can really increase fiscal space. And then restructuring away from loss making and current, always taxpayers supporting all kinds of industry which are fiefdoms of certain officials, to sort of supporting health, nutrition, externalities, where there are externalities which build capabilities, help the poor who really depend on public goods, because the rich can always find substitutes. That will really help the poor and enable them to participate in growth. I think there's one question here, which is that is it good to interfere in the chat box? Is it good to interfere in the monetary policy by the government as they are limited to fiscal rather than monetary policy? I think there's a misunderstanding today that because there's coordination or monetary policy seems to be supporting the recovery, that it's fiscal dominance, but that is not true at all. There are a lot of institutional mechanisms to ensure central bank independence that were put in with liberalization, and those hold good. But today, when there's coordination, the point I'm making is that the fiscal is better suited to act on the supply side to reduce inflation, whether it's food prices or it's taxation on oil or it's reducing logistics costs. So as long as they are acting, like the food inflation has been, international food prices were rising. In India, they have not. And of course, there's some set of people who say that farmers are being victimized because food prices are not rising. But you must understand that if you're moving towards an inflation target of 4%, you can't have prices rising much higher than that. And I think Professor Vishamdas can talk about this, but I think that the thing is that Indian farmers now are getting border prices. They're getting international prices. So they're actually asking for protection. Earlier it was that they were getting less than border prices. But, it has to be a rise in agricultural productivity and diverse sources of income that give them better incomes rather than just price increase. So I think in all these ways, we are seeing a transformation of the economy, which will give more space for government. As growth rises, also taxes rise. One reason for slow, like the government really tried to reduce deficits over the 2010s, but if interest rates are really high, real interest rate range as much as 4 to 5%. Yeah. And if growth is low, then there's less that you can do. That R minus G magic doesn't work. So if growth is better, if real rates are kept at around natural rates, I think the fiscal space will improve over the next year. We must ensure that. And it is independent also, because as long as the fiscal is acting on this inflation space and reducing inflation from the supply side, then monetary policy can support. But if inflation goes above the target, then monetary policy has to tighten inflation. So independence is there. And therefore, the expectations anchoring effect of inflation targeting continues. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well taken. Just one. Paul, just a quick comment to that. But that increasing divergence between the WPI and CPI is a matter of concern. And as per the new monetary policy framework, we are focusing only on the CPI inflation. And of course, it's now little above 6%. It's a little above the comfort zone. But can we say that, of course, prior to the new monetary policy framework, we have no inflation which is mounting to 11% or anything. But can we say that it's because of the, proper anchoring of inflationary expectations that, since 2016 or so, we are able to manage the CPI. CPI inflation only we are able to manage within the 6%. But yeah. So is it because of the better anchoring of the inflationary expectations in India? Yeah.
Still, again, everybody else, please mute their mics because we're getting some other noise. Yes, very good question and concern, Lekha. And here, I think that the issue is that headline CPI is what enters household inflation expectations, because food has the largest share there. And this is the index which is most amenable to domestic policy. So my own preference was that the central bank should focus on core CPI, because headline is subject to volatile food prices. But if headline is chosen, that is a political preference, then the government has a larger sort of role to play there to keep food prices, and domestic oil prices, the role of excise. And they have to take that responsibility, and they seem to be doing it. Because CPI headline is what enters household welfare, and ultimately, and therefore, that is determines their real rate. So as long as that is at 6%, and the deposit rates they're getting are around 6 or 7% fixed deposits, then at least they're earning something. They're not, in terms of their consumption basket, they're not that badly off. But for firms, WPI being so high, again, I've done some study which shows that in India, causality runs from CPI to WPI because it's important. And we know inflation targeting regimes, commodity price shocks, if they are transient, can be looked through, they won't raise other prices. So it depends on how persistent. And we know that oil prices have become very, very volatile. So they go up and they go down with great regularity since the 2000s. They don't stay high except in some episodes. So we hope that this, and similarly, the supply side bottlenecks is these logistics costs and also responsible for WPI rising. So if the WPI is the relevant producer price, and that is higher, that means that real rates are lower for firms who have to do investments, which is good for investment. But to the extent that this is a cost shock, then they are not, that product price is not happening. You see, again, the RBI data shows that firms are margins are steady despite the rise in oil prices. And the reason is that they have saved costs in this period. They have shown a lot of, in terms of work from home, in terms of restructuring to face the COVID, there has a lot of cost saving there. And therefore, despite the rise in commodity prices, they've been able to maintain margins. So this, and the pass-through seems to be waning. That is one reason why RBI has lower inflation guidance, because the firms don't seem to be passing through prices as much. They're able to absorb something because demand is low. So let us see how this goes up. But the earlier episode, high inflation episode in 2010, was very high CPI and low WPI. This time it's the reverse. I think this reverse is less dangerous in terms of creating persistent inflation than that episode in the previous. So let us see. It's all very difficult. And let us see how things work out. But I think there's a narrow kind of path to safety for the Indian. Yeah. I think, can we close now, Charan? You have some remarks?
Sure. I have a few announcements to make, housekeeping basically, but I want to thank both of you for a very interesting discussion. I knew Professor Ashima, who's a fiscal expert and chairing and part of the Monetary Policy Committee, won't let it go so easy. And
I hope you enjoyed the discussion. It was very good.
and I knew that that richness of in any such situation she is going to say that this is this. But my own feeling is, and this is my internal feeling with the cycle reversing in the US as well as in UK, that both the fiscal and monetary authorities in our country have been really coordinating very well. And I wouldn't say the word interfere. I would rather say the way they have coordinated with each other is so beautiful that they understand and they are together ensuring that the macro signals are properly transmitted and they are transmitted in a unison voice. So I would rather expect that the Monetary Policy Committee needs to be congratulated and thanked, the Governor of the RBI in general, as well as part of the Monetary Policy Committee, his sensitivities and the way the whole macro policy is operated in the country, I thought was very good. And of course, clearly, I find a clear distinction between what happened in the US and UK and other countries. I find our country did it very well. That's why I totally agree with Professor Ashima. We have done adequate. We haven't overdone it, and it didn't spill over into inflation. We haven't underdone it. We are still the fastest growing economy. So probably the doses that were given for stimulating our revival were very well measured and calculated. So, but the talk today has been very stimulating. I want to thank both Professor Lekha and Professor Ashima for taking us through this excellent thought process. The announcement is that by tomorrow noon, we will have the video available. I would invite all of you to look at it again. It's going to be very interesting. This week, the coming week, we are going to step a little on the side and think about something. The lifeline on India, I think, is Ganges. And recently, the book on Ganges has come out, Rejuvenating, Reimagining, and Reconnecting Ganges. The two co-authors are civil servants, Rajiv Ranjan Mishra, just retired, and Puskal Upadhyay, in service. And we are going to have discussions, and we're going to have a chair, an academic person who's going to chair it, and a discussant and practitioner from the World Bank. So I would invite you next week for a discussion on this book, Ganges, Rejuvenating, Reimagining, and Reconnecting. Same time, probably 4 to 5 or 5 to 6. So I'll send you a flyer, and I hope we all can join. To me, the riverfront, the water scarcity, all that discussion is going to come through. What Professor Lekha mentioned about the climate and economy, to me, what's happening in the riverfront is part of that. And cleaning Ganges is a very big project. All that is going to come through in the discussion next week. So I invite all of you for about an hour and 90 minutes, around 4 o'clock. We'll send you the flyer accordingly. With this, I want to thank each one of you for being with us on a holy day. I know I'm really happy to see that everybody had overcome the impact of holy drinks and ladoos, and they were all very sober. I thank each one of you, and I thank the participants for having asked those excellent questions which brought the best out of the speakers. Once again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, and happy Holi, everyone.
Thank you.